I'm an advisor in the global program on mainstreaming EbA here at GIZ. And I would like to welcome you to this launch event for a new publication on synergies between adaptation, biodiversity, and mitigation, and how EbA can build bridges between nationally determined contributions, NDC, and the new global biodiversity framework. This paper is a joint paper by Tora Ament and Lili Ilieva of Conservation and Development, myself, and my colleague Irinda Pugelpane. And I'll briefly take you through this paper, the main contents now. Today we have planned just maybe a 15-18 minutes input on the presentation and then room for discussion. And so we're not going to use a full hour schedule for this event. We might even finish after half an hour because you're all busy and we have all have a lot of online events. So our guiding questions today. There's already a lot of work on synergies. Why take another look at synergies? And why now? And that's also the first chapter of our publication. And then we have a second chapter on synergies in general, what we're considering when we look at it from EbA. We have specific examples all taken from updated NDC, one on water, one on agriculture, and one on cities. We are addressing maladaptation risk, and then we're concluding with some recommendation on how to move forward from our team of authors. But first of all, I would like to start with some quotes from the latest IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So it mentions that effective ecosystem-based adaptation reduces a range of climate change risks to people, biodiversity, and ecosystem services with multiple co-benefits. There's nothing new to an EbA community. But I'm quoting it still to underline that it underlines again that EbA is always not just about climate change, it's always about biodiversity and it's always about people. And it also states that nature-based solutions has the potential of nature-based solutions, and it mentioned that EbA is a subset of NBS, which is also our view here at the program. We consider nature-based solution on adaptation to be the same as EbA. And it says nature-based solution can provide an example on how innovative ideas can expand the climate solution space. So that's why we are looking at examples in this publication. And it states that adaptation strategies that treat climate, biodiversity, and human society as coupled systems will be most effective. And that's why we included a strong socioeconomic perspective on social justice, on society, and we also included a system perspective in this publication. So in a broader sense, our perspective on synergies, as I said, there's much work already done. I would like to highlight a series of 6 thematic papers done by GIZ colleagues at the SPA and Bioframe programs together with IISD and UFZ. These papers are available on adaptation community as well in the EbA community of practice there. And they have focused papers on finance, on the science perspective, etc. So that I highly would recommend these. What we did in our discussion paper, we are focusing on synergies between updated nationally determined contributions and the upcoming global biodiversity framework. I'll say more why we did that in a second. We're delving into sectors, so we look at water, agriculture, and cities because we have a lot of work on these sectors in the program already. So we have published a paper on integrated water resource management and EbA last year. We've published a publication on ecosystem soil this year. There's one on agroecology already coming up, and there's one on EbA in buildings coming up. And we also have a series of fact sheets on why working with nature matters, where there's also one part on water, one on agriculture, one on cities. So you can find all these materials if you're interested to learn more in sectors on our adaptation community page. We looked at, as I said, socioeconomic aspects and climate justice. We have more work, including a fact sheet and some cases on climate justice and EbA coming up. And we're addressing the risk of maladaptation in our discussion paper. So if we look at why did we do this now and where are we right now? So if we look at the climate agendas, so we'll have a strong adaptation focus at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. There's much discussion on the global goal on adaptation, including the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on this goal. We also see that we have, by now, most countries have submitted their updated nationally determined contribution, NDC. And we argue that when the first round of NDC, there was adaptation not in every NDC, and in many it was very general, and now we see they're more extensive, more on adaptation. There's more content in general, but also more on adaptation. And that makes them more robust because there's more measures and targets on adaptation in these NDC. And if we look at the biodiversity agenda, we see that the CBD COP was postponed several times. Part 2 will now happen in Montreal in December. There's a new global biodiversity framework being drafted right now. It will hopefully soon be finalized in Montreal, and then we'll update this publication according to the final new global biodiversity framework. And what we already know is that once we have a new GBF, there'll be a need for countries to update their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and NBSUP to align them with this new GBF. And we argue that this is a big opportunity to build upon updated NDC, because our assumption guiding this discussion paper is that you not only have more and more robust adaptation content in NDC, we also see that there's more nature-based solution content in many NDC. For example, the Euroclima Plus program in Latin America did an analysis, and they also came to the conclusion that there's not only nature-based solution on mitigation, there's actually more nature-based solution on adaptation. That's also one of our argumentation points, that you need to look beyond mitigation and NBS, that many NBS have very good examples on measures on adaptation, NBS on adaptation. And these measures can be a very concrete link between the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda, because if you look at the targets or the draft targets of the GBF, you find things that regardless of how exactly the wording and the ambition level will be, you'll find ecosystem protection, management, and restoration there. There's a whole chapter of the series of targets on meeting people's needs and sustainable use, with one target, for example, which will in one way or the other address regulation of air quality, water quantity and quality, protection from hazard and extreme events. And you can find all that in the updated NDC, in many of them. So we argue that you don't need to wait with the analysis of where potential links are until a final GBF is available. You can start the analysis of updated NDC already. So we picked 3 cases from these NDC, as I said, from water, agriculture, and cities. And the criteria for this selection were the level of ambition and how specific the measure is. So we didn't want to pick some measures which just mentions. We gave preference to anything where there was a quantified target. And we also asked, is there additional plan or is there some additional level of detail available? And we also favored measures where either EbA or NBS was explicitly included, and it wasn't just some activity which by a third party was labeled as NBS. And we tried a bit to some extent to look at the typical examples like afforestation, or there's a lot of work already on mangroves, but we chose inland wetland ecosystems in an example from Pakistan, silvopastoral systems as an example from Costa Rica, and urban green spaces, Jordan, area close to the host, the country of the next COP. And there on the urban green spaces, we also picked that for our maladaptation focus in the next chapter. But first of all, as I said, we're always added a strong socio-economic perspective. My colleague Irinda Pubelpanem did a lot of work on that, and I would like to give another quote from the IPCC report on this one, because the assessment report also mentioned that integrated and inclusive system-oriented solutions based on equity and social and climate justice reduces risk and enable climate resilient development. So this climate resilient development is a key theme of the report, and the report itself explicitly mentioned not only that you also always need to address social and climate justice, but also to look at with a system-oriented lens. And this we try to do this a bit to move away from silo mentalities on adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity. And we would argue that there's a need for a paradigm shift towards more system thinking and more inclusion of climate justice, including gender intersectionality. This, of course, always depends on context, and you'll find more on all these topics in the discussion paper. And as I said, we have a fact sheet on climate justice on EbA coming up, so please look out for that one. And now, very briefly on the cases, you'll find them more in the paper. So the first case on water, we chose Recharge Pakistan, restoring wetland ecosystems to reduce flood risk. We chose this long before a recent event, but you've seen the news and you know that the situation in Pakistan is still very bad. So it's apparently quite a timely topic. But we chose it because it has an ambitious and a quantified target on the need for support on EbA. It explicitly mentions EbA. And there's much detail available on what they're planning in a GCF concept note. So there's some space for some material to analyze. And the links to an upcoming GBF here would, apart from the climate target, which is obvious, would include links to ecosystem restoration, hazard reduction, mobilization of financial resources. If we look at the example from Costa Rica, which was promotion of agroforestry and silvopastoral system, which is included in several NDC, but in Costa Rica it has a quantified target. In this case, it has an area-based target, so amount of hectare under silvopastoral systems to be planted. It's interesting here that they have a chapter on forest and biodiversity in their NDC. So there's a very explicit biodiversity link. And potential links to the GBF would be recovery of degraded ecosystems, sustainable management of areas under agriculture. So there's, again, a different set of targets in the upcoming GBF, which would have links with this NDC measure. And the third example is on urban green spaces and cities, green infrastructure, urban resilience in Amman. Again, an ambitious target, a lot of details. There's an Amman resilience strategy. There's a climate plan 2050 for Amman. There's explicit mention of nature-based solutions. And here again, a completely different set of GBF targets where they potentially overlap, like protection from extreme events, integration into policy and planning of all levels of government. And so what we did based on the topic of urban green spaces in general and in our team, we did a workshop, we did a brainstorming because we believe that you need to look beyond just co-benefits. You can say, okay, we're planting trees and that's a mitigation impact and it is an adaptation impact, and planting trees in the city is good for urban biodiversity. But if you take a system perspective, you need to look much deeper and say, okay, what are impacts related to this and how might one impact lead to another impact? And you might end up with whole impact pathways, and not only positive ones, you might also have negative ones leading to maladaptation. And of course, we can't do a complete analysis, but we just wanted to show a way how you can start a discussion on maladaptation and system perspective and impact pathways. Again, to quote the IPCC report, which clearly states there's an increased evidence of maladaptation across many sectors and regions, and maladaptive responses to climate change create lock-ins of vulnerability, exposure, and risk, that they're difficult and expensive to change, and they're increasing the existing inequalities. And just an example how such a discussion on maladaptation risk might look like. So we discussed within our team that, okay, if you increase urban green spaces and this increases human well-being and quality of life, then you probably end up with more people wanting to move there, and this might drive up rents and real estate prices. This might lead to a phenomenon called eco-gentrification, so that our poorer households have to move to the periphery. And this all not on the concrete case, but in like a potential impact pathway, you might end up with urban sprawl, increased building activity, ecosystems in the surrounding areas being destroyed. And you might, in the worst case, end up with poor people living now in more disaster-prone areas and being more vulnerable than before. So this is one of the examples we're discussing in our chapter on system perspective and maladaptation risk. And then to conclude, I've said several things already. So we believe that nature-based solutions in updated NDC are a good starting point to create links to the upcoming global biodiversity framework. That's an analysis and identification of these links on potential synergies can increase coherence. And it might even increase access to international support because you would make your activities, your measures eligible for both agendas, for two funding lines, for climate and for biodiversity. We would argue that synergies should be treated as more than co-benefits. You should really take some time and take a system perspective and analyze impact pathways. We recommend to look at not a climate biodiversity synergies, but to look at mitigation and adaptation separately. Just to give an example here, we have I've recently published a publication on ecosystem soil. And with soil, if you look at it from a mitigation perspective, you look at soil organic carbon and how much CO2 equivalence does it store. From an adaptation perspective, you look at the ecosystem services and, for example, the role of healthy soils in the water cycle, and that's a completely different perspective. And so you should also look at synergies separately. I've said it several times, but we are repeating it again and again. Always include a socioeconomic perspective, include aspects of social justice, of climate justice, and always try to address maladaptation risk as well. And maybe one of the last quotes related to the IPCC, it clearly states that a lot of the adaptation efforts we see so far are short-term, following a short-term agenda, and this increases risk of maladaptation in the long term. And so they recommend to always aim for long-term policies. And as we see that the global biodiversity framework will have a 2050 vision, and in climate, we see a lot of work on long-term strategies, LTS, and similar papers. We recommend to look at synergies directly from a long-term perspective and try to mainstream it into long-term policy agendas as well. I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your question and comments. Sorry. So I see a lot of applause. I don't see a question yet. Do we have a question in the chat? Okay.
We had one that just came in. When we seek by Friedrich zur Heide, when we seek a highly needed integrated approach to think climate and biodiversity together through NDCs and NBSUBs, this would also need to translate into different approaches on how to support intra-institutional support. Maybe more of a comment, but I think important nonetheless.
Yes, and Friedrich, if you want to say more on that, I invite you to raise your hand and say more. But maybe on the NDC and NBSUB also a line of argument which we didn't include, but now we see a lot of programs working on the lessons learned from the NDC update process. And of course, I mean, you might even also have overlaps there that you just finished an update process of a national plan in the climate agenda, and maybe when you are facing the update of the NBSUB, there might be some lessons learned for that from the update process. Yes. Okay, and Lucas, thank you for posting the publication. It's available online from today, so you can already find it there now. As I said, we plan to update it once we have a final GBF. Maybe one comment on the GBF. We chose to use not the latest draft of the GBF. Also, we started this analysis earlier before it was available, but we chose the one I think from last year, whereas not everything is in brackets again. So we are fully aware that, for example, now we're talking about 22 targets, but we are still in our publication look at 21. But we'll update it accordingly once we have a final global biodiversity framework.
We have a raised hand from Friedrich zur Heide.
Yes.
Maybe if you want to speak up.
Yeah, just Olivier, thank you very much. As you asked me also to compliment, just to underline what I said, and thank you very much for this timely presentation on that need to integrate both mutually. Is that looking from an implementation perspective, the next thing that just immediately comes into my mind is how we would then really translate that into our institutional support, because in the end you're working with people and different institutions with different mandates, and to break those silos is the next step then to take, instead of just having the document and then not the right people not knowing how to tackle it. That was just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And this is also, I didn't mention it in this presentation, but there was this question, who's the target group? And we believe that from a climate agenda, we're always addressing the national climate focal points and the climate departments of Ministry of Environment or wherever they are located. And from the biodiversity agenda, you talk to the national biodiversity focal points. But maybe these two are always so busy or for other reasons that they're not always coordinating and talking to each other. I think we need more formats where we need to bring these two sides, the national focal points for climate and national focal points for biodiversity together to one event, to one discussion, and point out that it's not like an extra burden, it's not extra work for them, but they can actually both make their national policy stronger if they create more coherence by looking for these synergies. And they don't need to actually do something new, but because the overlaps are already there.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Or you don't have to ask a question. Please also give us comments if you don't disagree with something. Stephanie
We do have
Austin.
a raised hand from Stephanie Austin.
Yeah, Stephanie, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. One of the projects I'm working on now is analyzing the adaptation and mitigation aspects of NDCs. And one aspect we're looking at is whether they include nature-based solutions or EbA. And one thing I notice quite often is that they do include what I would call EbA measures, for example, in their adaptation actions, but they're not explicit. They don't point out, we're employing EbA measures. And I'm wondering if you think that this is all fine, it all equals out the same, at least they're, incorporating EbA, or is there missed opportunities by not using that kind of labeling?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because also, for example, in the Euroclima Plus analysis of Latin American NDC, they would say that NDC of, for example, Argentina and Brazil, they have a lot of nature-based solution in there. But of course, these are two countries which would not label their activities nature-based solutions, which are often very critical of this concept or have been in the past. That's why we look for countries which really explicitly mention nature-based solution, and we know that they're actually supporting the concept in the NDC. I would say if you're like from a donor perspective or a knowledge management perspective, and you want to start a discussion on this linking climate and biodiversity agendas, you should address these countries and these NDCs as well. Because in the end, whatever you call it NBS or ecosystem-based approach, it's about building stronger bridges between climate and biodiversity agendas. So I think you should approach these countries and include them as well, but you should be careful, like how to label it. Like you shouldn't approach a country that talking about the nature-based solution in their NDC if they didn't label it themselves, because they might be critical of the concept. That would be my personal take on this. But I would say, yes, you should look at NBS also in, for example, WWF does that. They have this paper, NDC, A Force for Nature. I think they have the 4th edition so far, and they're just analyzing where you have nature-based solutions in NDC, even if they're not labeled as such. Yeah, but I think we're making progress on nature-based solution. We have the UNEA definition, etc. But we still should be careful in where to use the term and how. So in national workshops in Brazil or in Namibia or so, I wouldn't use it. I don't see another question so far. Well, in that case,
we do have a comment
okay.
from Carlos Pedro Saavedra. In the last COP, SB and EbA were clearly at the forefront for nature restoration.
Mm-hmm.
What will be your expectation for the coming COP27 and the COP15 to be held in Canada?
Well, there's a lot of different things in that question. So increasing need for funding for adaptation, that will be big in Egypt. To what I've heard, that's always is, that at least 50% of funding should go to adaptation, that we need more funding for adaptation in general. But in terms of funding, I think in COP27, we'll see a very strong focus on loss and damage, really, which is not the same as adaptation. So I would expect that maybe the loss and damage debate, where there's still much disagreement on finance, etc., might overlay the adaptation discussion at COP27. But and that's also this global goal and adaptation. There's still more need for more progress there. And my expectation for COP15, I'm not in biodiversity, that much of a biodiversity expert, but I mean, everyone who's seen the development of the zero draft and first draft and then the latest draft, and then suddenly in the latest draft, everything was in brackets again. And so, I mean, for the COP15, the key thing is that they reach an agreement and we have a global biodiversity framework, because it was supposed to be post 2020, and now we're almost 3 years delayed. We're 2.5 years delayed. So, I mean, the main expectation is for COP15 that we get a new global biodiversity framework and we don't get another delay. That would be really important. And I see we have one person raising their hand. Erinda? Yes.
Yeah, and maybe I would just like to add to that, Uli, and to answer to Carlos, that I do foresee that also at COP27 on the climate conference, there will be quite a lot of discussions around nature-based solutions, and also in terms of finance. I mean, we know now that the joint statement for nature that was launched last year by the multilateral development banks, this year they are foreseeing to specify how much funds will actually flow into that, to specify how to implement it, which is pretty much based on nature positive investments, which consider nature-based solutions as one of the key ways to actually implement it. For example, then also the new program from the climate investment funds on nature, people, and climate, which also has nature-based solutions at the core of it. And for now, we know there's 170 million, I think it's US dollars, that already have been agreed on from countries, and there will be more to come. So this will also be discussed during the climate conference. And I think there's a few more. So I think you should stay tuned also on some of the side events, because a lot of these announcements will be made during some of the side events. And I think, Uli, you mentioned this morning, the Biodiversity Day is on the 16th of November. So maybe stay tuned for some of the sessions on that day as well.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of discussions on nature-based solutions on the 15th already. If you check the side event schedule, there's a IUCN event, and by many other people on the 15th on nature-based solutions. You have Adaptation Day on the Saturday, the 12th. So there'll be lots of side events on various topics. And yes, as Erinda, thank you for that addition. So probably some funding initiatives or funding pledges on nature-based solutions, but probably too early to say details on that. On the role of finance institutions, donors, so there's a new question in the chat. I'll just read. What do you think is the role of international finance institutions, donors, TC? I'm not sure what TC is here. To technical cooperation, sorry, to convince the biodiversity community in partner countries that EbA measures captured in NDCs might offer good opportunity to accelerate the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. Well, I think as I said, this is my personal opinion and not a GIZ official GIZ position, but I would expect that there's probably simply more money going into climate. So if you have activities which are not just labeled biodiversity, but they're actually the same targets or this very similar measures you're building up on the NDC, and you can have activities with ecosystem restoration or similar activities, which are clearly in the biodiversity agenda, but there's funding available, for example, for NDC implementation. And I believe there's a lot of money available for NDC implementation. Then of course it would be a missed opportunity if you don't address these potentials there. But it's not. I mean, I don't expect that funding will be explicitly labeled for synergies, like that there'll be extra funding for activities that are both in the NDC and the National Biodiversity Strategy or Action Plan, but that you need to take the activities which are already approved. And I think the benefit for any biodiversity focal point is that in many cases you have to fight for any progress on biodiversity policy, and to get a national commitment for any new activities, and then the NDCs are already approved and the countries have committed to it. So you don't need to negotiate if your country should do this or not. It's already, you have something to build on where the country already committed to measures with a high biodiversity benefit. So you have a good starting point, because a lot of the NB-sub, your national governments might have changed. They say, okay, this NB-sub is from 2015 or 2016. We were not government back then. We're not committed to this. But the NDC, they all committed, they submitted last year, and they submitted to these targets very recently. So these are very recent national commitments you can build on. So I think it would also facilitate the national discussion for biodiversity people to have something to start with, which the country already committed to. I don't see any further questions, and we said that we're all busy. We all have a lot of online events. So if there's no further question, the last thing I would like to do, if you're not on our EBA Community of Practice mailing list, please send us an email to eba@gz.de. I would like to also point out that we have our EBA Community of Practice workshop coming up, which will be hybrid in Bonn and online. And so I think the registration is open for online participation is open until the 28th. So if you're interested to continue the discussion with us, feel free to join us online for our EBA Community of Practice workshop end of November. It's November 23rd and 24th with an excursion on the 25th. Oh, then I think we have another hand by Tora, if I see that correctly.
Yes, thank you, Uli.
Oh.
And thank you for the presentation. I think you resumed it very well. My observation there is a call to all of us. I just recently did the training for the Alexander Humboldt scholars, all of them doing their PhDs in different disciplines and backgrounds and coming from all over the world. And a very strong call was made by them to please try to not segment according to our standards. So whether we call it EBA or not, or whether we consider this NBS or not too much focus on that, and rather try to come from the needs on the ground. So this is a call to all of us, I think, to really hear indigenous communities, local communities, young people, because I see the divide increasing between the COP communities and the people who attend versus the communities on the ground in ever so much increasing pressures and really devastating states, as we can see in many communities. So this is just one last observation from my side.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would once again, thank you for taking the floor. I would like once again to highlight that this is a joint work by 4 authors. So Tora and Lili Ilieva, they spend a lot of work on this publication, and they as a really valuable contribution. So thank you again for that. And we decided that it's just enough if one person presents the result, but there's really they spend a lot of time and work in making this bringing this paper to where it is today. And then, if there's no last question, I would like to make one last invitation that we have jointly launched an e-learning course on EbA. Together with IISD and IID, and funded also not only by ICI, but also Government of Canada. If you're interested to learn more, you're also invited. This is a self-guided e-learning course. It's already online. It was launched on October 4th, so it's very recent. And yeah, you can find this course on Adaptation community as well. Okay, if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you, all of you, for your participation, and we are looking forward to see you in the next event. Thank you and goodbye.